What happens when loyalty collides with power? When a centuries-old tradition meets modern royal drama? In the shadowed corridors of Buckingham Palace, where whispers carry more weight than proclamations, one man's devotion to duty would ignite a scandal that threatened to expose the royal family's most guarded secrets. This is the untold story of Captain James Morrison, a decorated royal guard whose unwavering commitment to Queen Elizabeth II would lead him into direct confrontation with a woman who would become queen consort. It began with something as simple as a dog's affection, but it would unravel into a tale of power, tradition, and the price of speaking truth to those who wear crowns. Behind palace walls, where protocol governs every breath and silence shields every scandal, one moment of defiance would echo through the halls of British royalty forever. This is that story, raw, unfiltered, and more shocking than any tabloid headline could capture. Captain James Morrison had served the crown for 23 years, but nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for the moment he would witness in the Queen's private apartments on that gray October morning. The 45-year-old officer, whose chest bore the proud medals of service in Afghanistan and countless royal protection duties, stood frozen as he watched a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The morning had begun like any other. Morrison arrived at Buckingham Palace at precisely 5:30, as he had every day for the past decade. His routine was sacred: check security reports, review the day's schedule, inspect the perimeter, and ensure that Her Majesty's beloved Pembroke Welsh corgis were safely accounted for in their designated areas. Queen Elizabeth II's devotion to her dogs was legendary, and Morrison had witnessed firsthand how these creatures provided her with comfort during the most challenging periods of her reign. Muick, the young dorgie that had been gifted to the Queen during the pandemic, held a special place in both the monarch's heart and Morrison's daily responsibilities. The dog had become the Queen's constant companion during her final months, rarely leaving her side during private moments. Morrison had observed how the Queen's eyes would light up whenever Muick bounded into her room, his tail wagging with unbridled enthusiasm. It was one of the few things that seemed to bring genuine joy to the aging monarch, especially as her health began to decline. On this particular morning, Morrison was conducting his routine security sweep of the Queen's private quarters when he heard voices coming from the sitting room. The Queen had passed away just 6 weeks earlier, and the palace was still adjusting to the new order under King Charles III. Most of the late Queen's personal belongings remained untouched, as per royal protocol, waiting for the appropriate time for distribution among family members. As Morrison approached the sitting room, he recognized the voice of Camilla, now the Queen consort, speaking in hushed but animated tones to her private secretary, Margaret Thornton. Morrison paused, not intending to eavesdrop, but something in the urgency of their conversation made him hesitate at the doorway. "I want that dog relocated immediately," Camilla was saying, her voice carrying an edge that Morrison had rarely heard in royal circles. "I don't care what sentimental value it held for her. I cannot have that creature underfoot every time I'm trying to establish my new routines here." Morrison's blood ran cold. They were discussing Muick, and from the tone of the conversation, it was clear that the Queen consort intended to remove the dog from the palace entirely. Margaret Thornton's response was carefully measured, as befitted someone who had navigated palace politics for years. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should discuss this with His Majesty first. The late Queen's dogs have traditionally remained within the royal household, and I believe the King has expressed wishes to honor that tradition." Camilla's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Charles has quite enough on his plate without worrying about every sentimental attachment his mother had. That dog serves no purpose here now, and I want to have my staff constantly accommodating its needs. Contact the appropriate agencies and have it rehomed. Quietly, of course. Morrison felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. In all his years of service, he had never heard anyone speak so callously about something that had brought the Queen such happiness. The image of Her Majesty's face when she played with Muick flashed through his mind, those precious moments of pure joy that had become increasingly rare in her final months. "Ma'am," Margaret continued cautiously. I should point out that the public has become quite attached to the story of the Queen's dogs. Any sudden disappearance might generate unwanted questions from the press. Then, we'll craft an appropriate story, Camilla replied curtly. Say the dog is being cared for by family members. The public doesn't need to know the details of every domestic arrangement within the palace. Morrison realized he was witnessing something that went beyond mere household management. This was about erasing traces of the late Queen's presence, about establishing new authority without regard for the traditions and sentiments that had defined the monarchy for decades. The casual dismissal of something so meaningful to Queen Elizabeth II struck him as a profound disrespect to her memory. The conversation continued, but Morrison had heard enough. He quietly retreated from the doorway, his mind racing with the implications of what he had overheard. As a royal guard, he was bound by strict protocols of discretion and non-interference in royal family matters. His role was to protect and serve, not to question the decisions of the royals he served. But this felt different. This wasn't about political decisions or ceremonial preferences. This was about the casual disposal of a living reminder of the late Queen's humanity. Morrison had seen how Muick had comforted the Queen during her loneliest moments, how the dog's presence had brought light to her eyes, even when state duties weighed heavily upon her shoulders. Throughout the remainder of that morning, Morrison found himself distracted from his usual duties. He kept thinking about the conversation he had overheard, about the implications of what the Queen Consort was planning. He had sworn an oath to serve the crown, but what did that mean when the current crown seemed intent on erasing the legacy of the previous one? During his lunch break, Morrison sought out Thomas Blackwood, the senior palace steward who had served the royal household for over 30 years. If anyone would understand the gravity of the situation, it would be Blackwood. They met in the staff quarters, away from the prying eyes and ears that seemed to be everywhere within the palace walls. Thomas, Morrison began carefully. I need to discuss something sensitive with you, something that concerns the welfare of one of the late Queen's dogs. Blackwood's weathered face grew serious. He had been present for countless palace crises and had developed an instinct for recognizing when something significant was brewing. Go on, James. You know, anything you say to me stays between us. Morrison related the conversation he had overheard, watching as Blackwood's expression grew increasingly troubled. When he finished, the older man was quiet for several long moments, staring out the window at the palace gardens where the Queen had once walked with her beloved dogs. I'm not surprised, Blackwood finally said, his voice heavy with resignation. There's been a lot of reorganization since the funeral. New preferences, new priorities. The Queen Consort is making it clear that she intends to put her own stamp on things. But this is different, Morrison insisted. We're talking about a living creature that brought comfort to Her Majesty. It's not like rearranging furniture or changing menu preferences. Blackwood nodded gravely. I understand your concern, James. I truly do. But you must realize the position you're in. Questioning the decisions of the Queen Consort, especially regarding household arrangements, could be seen as insubordination. You could lose your position, your pension, everything you've worked for. The weight of Blackwood's words settled heavily on Morrison's shoulders. He had devoted his entire adult life to serving the crown, building a career based on loyalty, discretion, and unwavering duty. The idea of jeopardizing that was terrifying, but the image of Muick being shipped off to some unknown fate was equally troubling. What would you do? Morrison asked quietly. Blackwood considered the question for a long time before answering. 20 years ago, I might have told you to keep your head down and follow orders. But I've seen too many good things disappear from this palace in the name of modernization and efficiency. Sometimes, James, a man has to decide what kind of legacy he wants to leave behind. That afternoon, Morrison found himself in the palace gardens, watching Muick play with a tennis ball that had belonged to the Queen. The dog's joy was infectious, his energy a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere that had pervaded the palace since the Queen's passing. Morrison couldn't help but imagine how devastating it would be for this innocent creature to suddenly, find himself in an unfamiliar environment, separated from everything he had ever known. As he watched Muick bound across the grass, Morrison made a decision that would change the course of his life. He would not stand by and watch as this last connection to the Queen's happiness was callously discarded. He would find a way to protect Muick, even if it meant confronting the most powerful woman in the realm. The challenge would be how to approach such a sensitive situation without destroying his career or creating a scandal that could damage the monarchy itself. Morrison knew he would need to be strategic, careful, and, above all, respectful in his approach. But he also knew that he could not live with himself if he remained silent while something precious was carelessly thrown away. As the sun began to set over the palace grounds, Morrison called Muick to his side and made a silent promise to the memory of Queen Elizabeth II. Her beloved companion would not be abandoned on his watch, regardless of the personal cost. The real question was whether he would have the courage to follow through when the moment of confrontation arrived. The following morning brought unexpected developments that would test Morrison's resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. As he arrived for his shift, he was informed by his supervisor, Commander Sarah Patterson, that there had been changes to the daily security rotation. Morrison would now be assigned to closer proximity duties with the Queen Consort household, effective immediately. "Consider it a promotion, Morrison," Patterson said with a slight smile. The Queen Consort specifically requested experienced officers for her security detail. "Your record speaks for itself." Morrison accepted the assignment with appropriate gratitude, but internally, he recognized the irony of the situation. He would now be in a position to observe firsthand the very person whose actions had troubled him so deeply. It was either an extraordinary stroke of luck or a dangerous complication that could make his planned intervention infinitely more difficult. His new duties required him to be present during the Queen Consort's private meetings and daily activities within the palace. It was during these observations that Morrison began to understand the broader scope of changes taking place within the royal household. Camilla was not simply making random adjustments to palace life. She was systematically implementing a comprehensive transformation of how the monarchy operated on a day-to-day basis. During his first week in the new position, Morrison witnessed several meetings between Camilla and various department heads. The Queen Consort was thorough, detail-oriented, and uncompromising in her vision for how the palace should function under her influence. She questioned everything from staff schedules to menu planning, from security protocols to media relation strategies. "I want to understand why we maintain certain traditions simply because they've always been done that way," she told the head of household services during one such meeting. "If something serves no practical purpose in our current context, then we need to evaluate whether it's worth preserving." Morrison found himself grudgingly impressed by her efficiency and clear thinking, even as he disagreed fundamentally with her approach to the Queen's legacy. She was undeniably intelligent and capable, which made her decision regarding Muick all the more troubling. This wasn't a case of someone making poor choices out of ignorance or incompetence. This was a deliberate decision by someone who understood exactly what she was doing. It was during his third day in the new assignment that Morrison encountered Princess and arriving at the palace for what appeared to be an unscheduled visit. The Princess Royal had always been known for her direct manner and her deep love for animals, qualities that had made her a favorite of her mother's. Morrison had worked with Princess and on numerous occasions and had always found her to be straightforward and practical. As Princess and made her way through the palace corridors, Morrison noticed that she paused at the sitting room where the Queen's dogs usually gathered. She called softly for Muick, and the dog came bounding over with his characteristic enthusiasm. Morrison watched as Princess and knelt down to greet the dog, her expression softening in a way that reminded him powerfully of the late Queen. "Hello there, boy," she murmured, scratching behind Muick's ears. "I've been thinking about you, wondering how you're adjusting to all these changes." Morrison realized that Princess and might be an ally in his efforts to protect Muick. She would have the authority and the family standing to challenge any decision about the dog's future and her well-known devotion to animal welfare made her a natural advocate for Muick's continued residence at the palace. The challenge was how to approach Princess and about the situation without compromising his position or revealing that he had been eavesdropping on private conversations. Morrison knew that any communication with a member of the royal family about such a sensitive matter would need to be handled with extreme discretion. An opportunity presented itself later that same day when Princess requested a security escort for a walk through the palace gardens. Morrison was assigned to accompany her, and he found himself alone with the Princess Royal for the first time since learning about Camilla's intentions regarding Muick. As they walked along the paths that the Queen had once traversed daily with her dogs, Princess seemed lost in thought. Finally, she broke the silence with a question that caught Morrison off guard. "Captain Morrison, in your experience, how are the palace animals adjusting to the changes since my mother's death?" The question was carefully phrased, but Morrison detected an underlying concern in her voice. He chose his words equally carefully in response. "Your Royal Highness, most of the animals seem to be adapting well to the new routines. However, I have noticed that some of them, particularly those that were closest to Her late Majesty, appear to be experiencing some difficulty with the adjustments." Princess nodded thoughtfully. "I imagine change is particularly difficult for creatures that thrive on routine and familiar surroundings. Have there been any discussions about long-term arrangements for my mother's dogs?" Morrison felt his pulse quicken. This was as close to a direct opening as he was likely to get, but he knew he had to proceed with extreme caution. "Ma'am, I believe there have been some preliminary discussions about future arrangements, though I'm not privy to the details of those conversations." "I see," Princess replied, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp with interest. "And, in your professional opinion, how important is it for these animals to maintain consistency in their living arrangements?" "From a security and welfare perspective, Your Royal Highness, I believe consistency is crucial for the animal's well-being. Sudden changes in environment or routine can cause significant stress, which could potentially impact both their health and their behavior." Princess stopped walking and turned to face Morrison directly. "Captain Morrison, I appreciate your professionalism and your obvious care for these animals. If you ever become aware of any plans that might not be in their best interests, I trust you would find an appropriate way to bring those concerns to the attention of someone who could address them." Morrison understood that he had just been given permission to communicate with Princess about any welfare concerns regarding the royal animals. It was a subtle but clear invitation for him to act as an informal advocate for the creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. The welfare of all palace residents, human and animal alike, is always a priority in my duties." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Camilla's private secretary, Margaret Thornton, who approached with the respectful urgency that characterized all palace communications. "Your Royal Highness, forgive the interruption," Margaret said with a slight bow. "The Queen Consort was hoping to speak with you at your convenience regarding some household arrangements." Princess Anne's expression remained neutral, but Morrison detected a slight tension in her posture. "Of course. Please tell her I'll be available in 15 minutes. As Margaret departed, Princess turned back to Morrison. "Captain, I believe our walk has been quite illuminating. Thank you for your insights regarding the welfare of the palace animals." Morrison understood that he had been dismissed, but as he prepared to leave, Princess added one more comment that sent a chill down his spine. "Captain Morrison, I hope you'll continue to monitor the situation closely. Sometimes the most vulnerable members of our household require additional protection, and I have confidence that you understand the importance of speaking up when necessary." As Morrison returned to his regular duties, he realized that Princess was already aware that something was brewing regarding the Queen's dogs. Her carefully worded questions and comments suggested that she had either heard rumors about Camilla's intentions or had concerns based on other information she had gathered. This realization both encouraged and worried Morrison. On one hand, it meant he was not alone in his concern for Muick's welfare. On the other hand, It suggested that the situation was already more politically charged than he had initially understood. If Princess Anne was positioning herself to protect the dogs, it meant she anticipated a conflict with Camilla over their future. Later that afternoon, Morrison witnessed another conversation that provided crucial insight into the timeline of Camilla's plans. As he stood outside the Queen Consort's private office, he overheard her speaking with someone on the telephone about logistics for the transition. "Yes, I understand the sensitivity of the matter," Camilla was saying, "but I want this handled within the week. The longer we delay, the more complicated it becomes. I've already spoken with the appropriate parties, and they're prepared to take responsibility for the animal's care." Morrison's heart sank as he realized that Camilla intended to move forward with her plan much sooner than he had expected. Whatever intervention he was planning, he would need to act quickly or risk losing the opportunity entirely. As his shift ended that evening, Morrison found himself face to face with a moral dilemma that would define the rest of his career. He had been given subtle permission by Princess and to advocate for the animal's welfare, but directly challenging the Queen Consort's decisions would require him to step far outside the bounds of his normal authority. The clock was ticking, and Morrison knew that within days, Muick could be removed from the palace forever. The question was whether he had the courage to take the extraordinary step of directly confronting the Queen Consort about her decision, knowing that such an action could end his career and potentially create a scandal that would damage the very institution he had sworn to protect. As Morrison made his way home that evening, he carried with him the weight of responsibility for a decision that seemed impossible to make correctly. Protect his career and remain silent, or risk everything to honor the memory of the Queen he had served faithfully for so many years. The choice would need to be made soon, and Morrison was running out of time to find a solution that could save both Muick and his own future within the royal household. The crisis came to a head on a Wednesday morning that started with an unusual flurry of activity in the palace's administrative wing. Morrison arrived to find several members of the household staff engaged in hushed conversations, their expressions suggesting that significant developments were underway. The tension in the air was palpable, and Morrison's instincts told him that the situation regarding Muick was reaching its climax. His suspicions were confirmed when he was summoned to Commander Patterson's office at 9 o'clock sharp. Patterson's expression was grave as she gestured for Morrison to take a seat across from her desk. The office, usually filled with the routine paperwork of palace security operations, now felt charged with an undercurrent of serious business. "Morrison," Patterson began without preamble, "I need to inform you that there will be some changes to the household arrangements today. Specifically, regarding the late Queen's dog, Muick. You're to assist with the logistics of his relocation this afternoon." Morrison felt his stomach drop, but he maintained his professional composure. "Relocation, Mom? May I ask where the dog is being relocated to?" Patterson consulted a document on her desk. "He's being transferred to a private residence in the countryside. A family with extensive experience caring for the breed has agreed to provide him with a suitable home. The Queen Consort feels it's in the animal's best interest to have more space and individual attention than could be provided within the palace environment." The explanation was polished and reasonable sounding, exactly the kind of public relations language that Morrison had expected. But he knew the truth behind the decision, and the carefully crafted justification only made him more determined to act. "Ma'am, if I may ask, has this decision been discussed with other members of the royal family? I know that the late Queen's dogs have traditionally remained within the royal household." Patterson's expression sharpened slightly. "Morrison, the Queen Consort has the authority to make decisions regarding household arrangements. Your role is to assist with the implementation of those decisions, not to question their wisdom or propriety." Morrison recognized that he was being warned to stay in his lane, but he also realized that this was likely his last opportunity to prevent what he saw as a grave injustice. The moment of decision had arrived, and he could either remain silent and complicit or take the extraordinary step of challenging the system he had served faithfully for over 2 decades. "Ma'am, I understand my role and responsibilities. However, I would like to request permission to speak directly with the Queen Consort about this matter. I believe there may be considerations that haven't been fully explored. The silence that followed Morrison's request seemed to stretch for an eternity. Patterson stared at him with a mixture of surprise and concern, clearly recognizing that her subordinate was venturing into dangerous territory. Morrison, I strongly advise against such a request. The Queen Consort's decisions regarding household matters are not subject to input from security personnel. Attempting to circumvent the established chain of command on this issue could have serious consequences for your career. Morrison took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would irrevocably change his relationship with the palace hierarchy. Ma'am, I respect your advice, but I believe this situation involves considerations beyond normal household management. I request formal permission to address my concerns directly with the Queen Consort. Patterson leaned back in her chair, studying Morrison with the careful attention of someone trying to assess whether a valued subordinate had suffered some kind of mental breakdown. Morrison, you're one of my most reliable officers. Your record is exemplary, and you have a reputation for sound judgment. That's why I'm going to give you one more opportunity to reconsider this request. Ma'am, I considered it carefully, and I believe it's the right course of action. Patterson sighed heavily and reached for her telephone. Very well. I'll see if the Queen Consort has time to see you this morning. But, Morrison, I want you to understand that once you walk into that room, there's no going back. Whatever you say to her will be on record, and the consequences will be yours to bear. 30 minutes later, Morrison found himself standing outside the Queen Consort's private office, his heart pounding with a combination of nervousness and determination. He had spent the intervening time carefully planning what he would say, knowing that he would have only one opportunity to make his case effectively. Margaret Thornton opened the door and gestured for him to enter. Her Majesty will see you now, Captain Morrison. Please keep in mind that her schedule is quite full today. Morrison stepped into the elegantly appointed office where Camilla sat behind an antique desk, reviewing documents with the focused attention that had become her trademark. She looked up as he entered, her expression politely curious, but with an underlying steel that reminded him exactly who he was dealing with. Captain Morrison, she said, gesturing for him to take a seat in one of the chairs facing her desk. I understand you've requested this meeting to discuss household arrangements. I confess I'm somewhat surprised, as security personnel don't typically involve themselves in such matters. Morrison remained standing, a decision he had made to convey the formal nature of his intervention. Your Majesty, I appreciate your time, and I want to assure you that I don't take this step lightly. I'm here to discuss the planned relocation of Muick, the late Queen's dog. Camilla's expression didn't change, but Morrison detected a slight tightening around her eyes. I see. And what exactly is your concern regarding this household decision? Morrison had rehearsed this moment dozens of times in his mind, but now that he was face to face with the Queen Consort, he found himself struggling to find the right words to express his concerns without sounding accusatory or insubordinate. Your Majesty, during my years of service to the late Queen, I observed how important her dogs were to her well-being and happiness. Muick in particular provided her with significant comfort during her final months. I believe that relocating him from the palace represents a departure from royal tradition that may not serve the best interests of the monarchy. Camilla leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled as she considered Morrison's words. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. Captain Morrison, I appreciate your devotion to my late mother-in-law's memory. However, I think you may be overstepping the bounds of your expertise. The decision to relocate Muick has been made after careful consideration of what's best for the animal and for the efficient operation of the household. Morrison felt his resolve strengthen at her dismissive tone. This was the moment when he would either retreat and accept defeat or push forward with the full knowledge that he was risking everything he had worked for. Your Majesty, with respect, I believe there are considerations that may not have been fully explored. The late Queen specifically expressed wishes regarding the care of her dogs, and I believe Prince William and Princess and would want to be consulted about any major changes to those arrangements. The mention of other royal family members caused a noticeable shift in Camilla's demeanor. Her polite mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of irritation that suggested Morrison had touched on a sensitive nerve. Captain Morrison, I think you may be confused about your role here. You are employed to provide security services, not to interpret the wishes of deceased monarchs or to presume knowledge of what other family members might want. The decision has been made, and it will be implemented as planned. Morrison realized that he had reached the point where further diplomacy would be useless. Camilla had made it clear that she viewed his concerns as irrelevant interference, and she had no intention of reconsidering her decision based on his input. This was the moment when he would either retreat or make the kind of stand that could end his career. Your Majesty, I believe you have the legal authority to make this decision. However, I also believe it's my duty to inform you that I cannot in good conscience assist with the implementation of this plan. I will be submitting a formal report to Commander Patterson documenting my concerns about this matter. The room fell silent as the implications of Morrison's statement sank in. He had just informed the Queen Consort that he was refusing to carry out her orders and that he intended to create an official record of his objections. In the hierarchical world of palace service, this was tantamount to open rebellion. Camilla's voice, when she spoke again, was ice cold. Captain Morrison, I want to make sure I understand you correctly. You are refusing to carry out a direct instruction from me regarding a household matter, and you are threatening to create official documentation that questions my judgment. Morrison maintained eye contact, knowing that any sign of weakness now would undermine everything he was trying to accomplish. Your Majesty, I am documenting my professional concerns about a decision that I believe conflicts with established royal traditions and the wishes of the late Queen. I believe this documentation is necessary to protect both the interests of the monarchy and my own professional integrity. Camilla stood up slowly, her posture conveying barely controlled anger. Captain Morrison, I think this conversation has gone quite far enough. You will report to Commander Patterson immediately, and you will carry out whatever instructions she gives you regarding today's arrangements. Any documentation you create will be reviewed through the appropriate channels, and I suspect you'll find that your interpretation of royal traditions and protocols may not align with current realities. Morrison recognized his dismissal, but before leaving, he decided to make one final statement that would ensure there could be no misunderstanding about his position. Your Majesty, I want to be clear that my concerns stem from my deep respect for the late Queen's memory and my commitment to serving the crown with honor. I believe that preserving the connections to her legacy, including her beloved dogs, serves the long-term interests of the monarchy, even when it may conflict with short-term administrative convenience. With that, Morrison turned and left the office, knowing that he had just irrevocably altered the course of his life. He had challenged one of the most powerful people in the realm, created an official conflict that would require resolution at the highest levels, and positioned himself as a defender of traditions that the current leadership clearly wanted to abandon. As he walked back through the palace corridors, Morrison felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. He had finally spoken truth to power, but the consequences of that action were only beginning to unfold. The real question now was whether his gambit would succeed in protecting Muick or whether he had simply destroyed his own career for nothing. The aftermath of Morrison's confrontation with the Queen Consort unfolded with the swift efficiency that characterized all palace crises. Within an hour of his meeting with Camilla, Morrison found himself summoned to an emergency session with not only Commander Patterson, but also Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary, and Lord Chamberlain Baron Parker of Mincemere. The presence of such high-ranking officials made it clear that Morrison's rebellion had escalated far beyond a simple personnel issue. The meeting took place in the Lord Chamberlain's office, a room that had witnessed countless moments of palace drama over the centuries. As Morrison entered, he was struck by the gravity of the situation reflected in the faces of the three officials who would now determine his fate. Sir Clive, a man known for his diplomatic skills and unflappable demeanor, looked particularly troubled. "Captain Morrison," Lord Parker began without preamble, "we find ourselves in an unusual situation. It's been reported that you've refused to carry out instructions from the Queen Consort and have threatened to document your objections to her decisions regarding household arrangements." Morrison stood at attention, recognizing that this was likely to be the most important conversation of his professional life. "My lord, I want to clarify that I haven't threatened anyone. I have expressed concerns about a decision that I believe conflicts with established protocols and the documented wishes of the late Queen regarding the care of her animals." Sir Clive leaned forward, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Captain Morrison, help us understand your position here. You've served with distinction for over 20 years, and your record shows consistent respect for authority and protocol. What has led you to take such an extraordinary step?" Morrison had anticipated this question and had spent the past hour formulating his response. He knew that his answer would determine whether his actions were viewed as principled advocacy or dangerous insubordination. "Sir Clive, my oath of service includes a commitment to protect the interests of the monarchy and to uphold the traditions that define our institution. I believe that the casual disposal of the late Queen's beloved companion represents a break with those traditions that could damage public perception of the royal family's values." Lord Parker exchanged glances with his colleagues before responding. "Captain Morrison, while we appreciate your commitment to tradition, you must understand that the Queen Consort has the authority to make decisions regarding household arrangements. Your role is not to evaluate or challenge those decisions." Morrison took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either justify his actions or confirm that he had made a terrible mistake. "My lord, I believe there's a distinction between routine household management and decisions that affect the legacy of a deceased monarch. The late Queen's dogs weren't simply pets. They were symbols of her humanity and her connection to the British people. Their fate reflects on our respect for her memory." The room fell silent as the three officials considered Morrison's argument. Commander Patterson, who had remained quiet during the exchange, finally spoke up. "Morrison, I understand your passion about this issue, but you must realize that your approach has created an impossible situation. The Queen Consort cannot have her authority publicly questioned by security personnel, regardless of the merits of your concerns." Before Morrison could respond, there was a knock at the door. Margaret Thornton entered with an expression that suggested urgent developments. "Gentlemen, forgive the interruption," she said with a slight bow. "His Majesty has requested an immediate audience with Captain Morrison. He wishes to see him in his private study within the next 10 minutes. The announcement sent a shock through the room. King Charles III had apparently decided to involve himself directly in the situation, which elevated it to the highest levels of palace politics. Morrison felt his mouth go dry as he realized that he would now have to explain his actions to the monarch himself. As Morrison made his way to the king's private study, he passed through corridors lined with portraits of previous monarchs, each of whom had faced their own crises and challenges. He found himself wondering what Queen Elizabeth II would think of the situation that had developed over the fate of one of her beloved dogs. King Charles III was standing by the window when Morrison entered, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the palace gardens. The king's expression was thoughtful rather than angry, but Morrison knew better than to interpret that as a sign that he was not in serious trouble. "Captain Morrison," the king said without turning around, "I'm told that you've created quite a stir over the arrangements for my mother's dog." Morrison remained at attention, unsure whether he was expected to explain himself or simply listen to whatever judgment the king had reached. "Your Majesty, I acted according to my understanding of my duties and my respect for the late Queen's memory." King Charles turned to face Morrison, his expression unreadable. "Tell me, Captain Morrison, what exactly did you observe that led you to believe intervention was necessary?" Morrison realized that this was his opportunity to present his case directly to the ultimate authority in the matter. He chose his words carefully, knowing that the king's response would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the fate of Muick as well. Your Majesty, I observed that plans are being made to remove Muick from the palace without consultation with family members who might have wishes regarding his care. I also witnessed the casual dismissal of the animal's emotional significance to the late queen. I believe that this situation required advocacy to ensure that all considerations were properly weighed. The king nodded slowly, suggesting that Morrison's explanation aligned with information he had already received. Captain Morrison, I want you to understand that I'm not unaware of the situation you've described. However, your approach to addressing it has created complications that extend far beyond the welfare of one animal. Morrison felt a sinking sensation in his stomach as he realized that the king was likely preparing to discipline him severely for his insubordination. However, what happened next surprised him completely. That said, the king continued, I cannot ignore the validity of your concerns or the courage it took to raise them. My mother's dogs were indeed important to her, and their welfare is a matter of family interest, not merely household administration. Before Morrison could fully process the implications of the king's statement, there was another knock at the door. This time, Princess Anne entered the room, her expression suggesting that she was well aware of the crisis that had developed. Charles, she said with the directness that characterized all her interactions, even with the monarch. I understand we're discussing the situation with Mother's dog. I want you to know that I've been monitoring this matter, and I have concerns about the approach that's been taken. The king gestured for his sister to join the conversation, and Captain Morrison has raised questions about the decision to relocate Muick. I'd like to hear your perspective on the matter. Princess Anne turned to Morrison with an expression that suggested she was not entirely surprised to find him at the center of the controversy. Captain Morrison, I want to commend you for speaking up about this situation. It takes considerable courage to challenge authority when you believe an injustice is being committed. Morrison felt a wave of relief wash over him as he realized that Princess Anne was supporting his position. However, he also understood that the situation was now openly pitting different factions of the royal family against each other, with potentially serious consequences for palace unity. Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, Morrison said carefully, I want to emphasize that my sole concern is ensuring that the late Queen's wishes regarding her animals are respected and that decisions are made with full consideration of all relevant factors. King Charles nodded thoughtfully. Captain Morrison, I appreciate your commitment to my mother's memory. However, we now need to find a resolution that addresses your concerns while also maintaining the proper functioning of the household hierarchy. Princess Anne stepped forward with the decisiveness that had made her one of the most respected members of the royal family. Charles, I think the solution is quite straightforward. The dogs should remain within the family, as has always been the tradition. If there are concerns about household management, then we can discuss alternative arrangements that keep the animals within the royal circle. The king considered his sister's suggestion before turning back to Morrison. Captain Morrison, if arrangements were made to ensure that Muick remained within the royal family's care, would that address your concerns about honoring my mother's wishes? Morrison felt a surge of hope as he realized that his gamble might actually succeed in protecting Muick. Your Majesty, yes, that would fully address my concerns. I believe the late Queen's primary wish was that her dogs receive loving care within the royal household. King Charles nodded decisively. Very well. I'll speak with the Queen Consort about modifying the arrangements for Muick. However, Captain Morrison, we still need to address the manner in which you handled this situation. Your concerns were valid, but your approach created unnecessary conflict. Morrison understood that while he might have succeeded in protecting Muick, there would still be consequences for his insubordination. However, he also recognized that the king's intervention had likely saved both his career and the dog he had sought to protect. Your Majesty, I accept full responsibility for any disruption my actions may have caused. I believe that the situation required immediate intervention, but I acknowledge that there may have been better ways to address my concerns. Princess Anne interjected with characteristic bluntness. Charles, Captain Morrison did exactly what any of us would want our staff to do when they witness something that conflicts with our family's values. He should be commended. not punished. The king looked between his sister and Morrison, clearly weighing the political implications of the situation against the practical need to maintain discipline within the palace hierarchy. "Captain Morrison," he said finally, "I'm going to ask Commander Patterson to reassign you to duties that better utilize your commitment to protecting royal traditions. Consider this a lateral transfer that recognizes your unique perspective on palace operations." Morrison realized that he was being offered a face-saving resolution that would protect his career while removing him from the immediate sphere of the Queen Consort's authority. It was a diplomatic solution that addressed everyone's concerns without creating a public scandal. "Your Majesty, I'm grateful for your consideration and your commitment to honoring the late Queen's memory. I will continue to serve the crown with the same dedication I've shown throughout my career." As Morrison left the king's study, he reflected on the extraordinary events that had unfolded from his simple desire to protect a dog that had brought joy to Queen Elizabeth II. He had challenged the most powerful people in the realm, risked his career, and ultimately succeeded in ensuring that Muick would remain within the royal family's care. The real test, however, would be how the palace community absorbed the lessons of this crisis, and whether it would lead to more thoughtful consideration of how traditions should be preserved in a modernizing monarchy. 3 months after the confrontation that nearly ended his career, Captain James Morrison found himself in an unexpected position within the palace hierarchy. His new role as special advisor for royal traditions and protocol had been created specifically to address the gaps in communication that had led to the crisis over Muick. Rather than being punished for his insubordination, Morrison had been tasked with ensuring that future decisions properly balanced modernization efforts with respect for established traditions. The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. Morrison's relationship with the Queen Consort remained professionally cordial, but personally strained. Camilla had ultimately accepted the king's decision to keep Muick within the royal family, but the manner in which her authority had been challenged clearly still rankled. Their interactions were now filtered through layers of protocol and careful diplomacy that acknowledged the new reality of Morrison's enhanced status within the palace hierarchy. Muick, for his part, seemed blissfully unaware of the palace intrigue that had swirled around his fate. The dog had been relocated to Princess Anne's residence at Gatcombe Park, where he joined a household already well-equipped to care for royal animals. Morrison visited regularly to check on Muick's welfare, and each time he was struck by how content the dog appeared in his new environment. Princess Anne's practical approach to animal care and her genuine affection for the creatures in her charge had created an ideal situation for the late Queen's beloved companion. The broader implications of Morrison's stand, however, extended far beyond the fate of a single dog. His actions had forced the royal family to confront fundamental questions about how decisions were made within the palace, and whose voices were considered when traditions were evaluated for their continued relevance. King Charles III had taken the crisis as an opportunity to implement new protocols for significant household changes. A new committee structure now ensured that decisions affecting the late Queen's legacy would be reviewed by multiple family members before implementation. The committee included Princess and Prince William and representatives from the household staff, creating a more collaborative approach to managing the transition between reigns. Morrison's new role required him to document and preserve the institutional knowledge that had previously existed only in the memories of long-serving staff members. He spent his days interviewing palace veterans, recording their insights about royal traditions, and creating comprehensive guides for future decision-makers. It was painstaking work, but Morrison found it deeply satisfying to contribute to the preservation of the monarchy's historical continuity. One particularly meaningful aspect of his new duties involved working with the royal collection to catalog the late Queen's personal possessions and ensure that items with historical or sentimental significance were preserved appropriately. Morrison discovered that Queen Elizabeth II had left detailed written instructions about the care of her dogs, including specific wishes about their placement should anything happen to her. These documents, which had been overlooked during the initial transition planning, provided vindication for Morrison's instincts about the importance of maintaining royal traditions. The discovery of the Queen's written wishes regarding her dogs created a diplomatic challenge that required careful handling. The documents made it clear that the late Queen had indeed intended for her dogs to remain within the royal household, preferably under the care of family members who shared her love of animals. The existence of these instructions meant that Camilla's original plan to relocate Muick had directly contradicted the deceased monarch's explicit wishes. Sir Clive Alderton, in his role as the king's private secretary, handled the delicate task of communicating this information to all relevant parties without creating additional conflict. The discovery was framed as a fortunate development that allowed the family to honor the late Queen's wishes more completely, rather than as evidence that mistakes had been made in the original planning. Morrison watched these diplomatic maneuverings with a mixture of satisfaction and cynicism. While he was pleased that the truth had eventually emerged, he was also struck by how much effort was required to smooth over conflicts that could have been avoided with better initial consultation. The incident had highlighted the importance of institutional memory and the dangers of making decisions without fully understanding their historical and emotional context. 6 months after the crisis, Morrison received an unexpected invitation to attend a private dinner at Clarence House. The guest list included King Charles III, Princess and Prince William, and several senior palace officials who had been involved in resolving the Muick situation. Notably absent was the Queen Consort, whose schedule apparently prevented her from attending. During the dinner conversation, Prince William raised a toast that surprised Morrison with its directness. "I want to recognize Captain Morrison's courage in speaking up for what he believed was right, even when it meant challenging authority. The palace works best when people at all levels feel empowered to raise concerns about decisions that affect our family's values and traditions." King Charles III nodded in agreement, adding his own perspective. Captain Morrison's actions reminded us that modernization doesn't require abandoning everything from the past. Sometimes the most important changes involve finding better ways to preserve what matters most. Princess Anne, with characteristic bluntness, provided perhaps the most meaningful endorsement of Morrison's actions. "Captain Morrison did exactly what I hope any member of our staff would do if they saw something that conflicted with our family's principles. His loyalty wasn't to individuals or to hierarchy. It was to the institution and the values it represents." As the evening progressed, Morrison found himself part of conversations about broader reforms within the palace administration. His experience had sparked discussions about creating formal channels for staff members to raise concerns about policy decisions, and about ensuring that transitions between reigns included proper consideration of predecessors' documented wishes. The dinner also provided Morrison with an opportunity to observe the family dynamics that had shaped the crisis. It was clear that Princess and Prince William had developed a stronger alliance around preserving their mother's legacy, while King Charles III was working to balance respect for tradition with his wife's desire to establish her own approach to royal duties. The tension between these competing priorities remained unresolved, but Morrison's intervention had at least ensured that future conflicts would be handled through established procedures rather than behind-the-scenes maneuvering. 1 year after the confrontation, Morrison was invited to accompany Princess and on a visit to Gatcombe Park to check on Muick and the other royal dogs in her care. As they walked through the grounds where the animals roamed freely, Morrison reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Muick bounded over to greet them with the same enthusiasm he had shown during his days at Buckingham Palace. The dog's coat was glossy, his energy was boundless, and his obvious contentment provided the best possible validation of Morrison's decision to fight for his welfare. "You know, Captain Morrison," Princess said as she scratched behind Muick's ears, "my mother would have been proud of what you did. She always valued loyalty and courage, especially when they were demonstrated on behalf of those who couldn't speak for themselves." Morrison felt a deep sense of satisfaction at Princess Anne's words. The recognition from someone who had known the late Queen so intimately meant more to him than any official commendation could have provided. As they prepared to leave Gatcombe Park, Morrison took one last look at Muick playing in the gardens that had become his new home. The dog that had unknowingly triggered a palace crisis was now living exactly the kind of life that Queen Elizabeth II would have wanted for him, surrounded by people who understood his needs, in an environment that celebrated the bond between humans and animals that had been so important to the late monarch. The drive back to London provided Morrison with time to consider the lessons of his extraordinary year. He had learned that even the most established institutions could be changed by individuals willing to speak up for their principles. He had discovered that challenging authority, when done respectfully and for the right reasons, could actually strengthen rather than weaken the system. Most importantly, he had proven to himself that his loyalty to the crown extended beyond following orders to actively protecting the values that made the monarchy worthy of that loyalty. As Morrison returned to his duties at Buckingham Palace, he carried with him a new understanding of his role within the royal household. He was no longer simply a security officer following instructions. He was a guardian of traditions, a voice for those who couldn't advocate for themselves, and a bridge between the monarchy's past and its future. The confrontation over Muick had ended with the dog safe and happy in Princess Anne's care. Morrison elevated to a position where he could continue protecting royal traditions, and the palace administration reformed to prevent similar conflicts in the future. It was a resolution that honored both the need for change and the importance of continuity, proving that even in the rarefied world of royal protocol, courage and conviction could still make a difference. Morrison's story became a quiet legend within palace circles, a reminder that speaking truth to power, even at great personal risk, remained one of the most important duties of anyone who served the crown. And in the gardens of Gatcombe Park, a contented dog named Muick served as a living testament to the power of one person's determination to do what was right, regardless of the consequences.